All right. Thank you once again for the co-creation of this interaction and the allowance for us to experience each and every one of you, one of the facets of the multidimensional crystal of creation. We would like to say something about nothing. And the thing that we would like to say is that nothing is still something. We have discussed the idea of the difference between what we call all that is, what you in your society typically refer to as God. The difference between that and what we have referred to as the One. Now, it's all, in a sense, God, if you want to use that term. But the One, as we have discussed, is a homogeneous, unbroken experience of existence that within itself has no awareness of itself, has no experience of itself. When it has been discussed, either in metaphysics or in science, that everything came from nothing, it's not really about the idea of non-existence. That's very different than nothing. And that's why we said nothing is still something. But it is an undifferentiated state that allows for no awareness of self and no experience, and it is that nothing that we're talking about. No experience, no thing, no awareness, because there is no reflection. Without a reflection, there is no self-awareness. Because in order for you to know the self, you have to have a sense of an other. Otherwise, if it's totally unbroken, there is nothing to reflect back to you that you exist. So the One has no awareness of its existence. It is simply the pure state of existence itself. But within the One, there has to be that one aspect that does know itself, that does experience reflection, that does experience reflection as other than self, which then reinforces the idea of its own selfhood. And that self-aware aspect of the One that is unaware is what we call all that is. It exists within the One. It is the self-aware aspect of the One. And it is in reflecting itself to itself through vibrational patterns within the One, then allowing that reflection to expand and continue and keep reflecting on and on and on and on and on and on and on to infinity, to eternity, forever and ever. This happens because there is nowhere else to go but being within the One, and therefore any reflection that might be existing within the One that becomes self-aware has nowhere to go but bounce around in that point, in that moment. And by bouncing around in that moment, it creates more and more and more and more reflections, which is what you experience as the expansion of existence, the expansion of creation, the expansion of the universe. But it's not really expanding outward. There is no outward. It's all happening within that single point, what we will call a moment point, because that moment point only has one moment, only has one point. You call them generally here and now, because there is nothing else, there is nowhere else, there is no other time really. So within the all that is, in the moment point that is God, in the total now, in the total here within the one, everything that you know, everything that you ever will know, everything you have ever known has happened, will happen, is happening. So the idea of the Big Bang expanding outward is an illusion, because it's all taking place within that same one single moment, in that same one single point. But all of the vibrational reflections within that moment point create what appears to be the illusion of outward expansion. And therefore you assume from your physical perspective that creation is expanding outward and growing in that sense into space and time. But it's not. It's all taking place within that single point. And I mean everything, everywhere, everywhen, all time, all space, all parallel realities, all dimensions are simply different vibrational reflections within that same moment point of itself, reflecting to itself, being self-aware on all levels of itself, because everything is made out of that consciousness. And that's what consciousness is. Consciousness is self-awareness. As soon as that aspect of the one knew itself through the first reflection by knowing itself compared to the reflection which is seen as the other, that dynamic itself is actually what creates your experience called consciousness. You are self-aware. And therefore everything is made of that consciousness. Everything within God is God, made of God, for there is nothing else to make anything from. So everyone is all that is, experiencing itself as all the reflections that it is aware of itself. So each of us and each of you are all those reflections. You are all that is, but experiencing itself as a part of all that is. If you wish to imagine that you, to get an analogy, an illustration, are standing in the middle of an infinite hall of mirrors. And as you look around, you see all your reflections from different angles, because not only are you seeing your reflections, because of the different angles of the mirror, you are seeing reflections of your reflections and reflections of your reflections of your reflections, and on and on and on and on from all the different angles you can, which means that some of the reflections will face you, some of them will be sideways, some of them will even be the back of you, because the reflections are reflecting into other reflections, so that you can experience every bit of all of the reflections that are reflections of you. But in the case of all that is, because everything is made of that self-awareness, everything is made of that consciousness, in this case of all that is, all of the reflections, being you and us, are actually also conscious, are also self-aware. That's the quality that exists within all the reflections. They're not just empty reflections in the way that you understand reflections in a glass mirror. Every reflection within creation is conscious in its own way. Even the idea of a rock is self-aware. It may not be exactly the same way that you are self-aware, the way you express consciousness, but it is still aware that it is this rock and not that rock. And the way that beings, expressions of consciousness, such as rocks, can do that, one of the ways is through you observing that there is this rock and that rock. So in other words, reflections can use each other to become self-aware in different ways. So because you are capable of observing that there are two different rocks, the rocks themselves then through you know that they are this rock and that rock, because it's all reflections of the same consciousness. And it doesn't have to have its own apparently self-contained awareness in the way that you feel you do in order to be aware that it is conscious, that it is what it is, separate from what other things are. Of course, again, there is no real separation. The separation is an illusion of that vibrational reflection. Just as, again, going back to the illustrative analogy, when looking at reflections in a hall of mirrors, you know, in a sense, that those reflections are not really separate from you really, because it's all the light going from you into the mirror and back to you. It's just the way you have set it up, but the reflection is an aspect of you. And it only appears to be separate because of the illusion of the framework of space and time that you have turned that single moment point into, from this perspective, this point of view, of that single moment, of that point. Because that's all you ever experience. What seem like different places, what seem like different moments in time and space are the same moment, the same place, the same point from a different angle, a different reflective perspective. There is only here, there is only now, and everything, to put it in your language, is happening in that same moment. Everything simultaneously exists, and I mean everything. Leaves nothing out because it's all contained within that moment point, reflecting to itself over and over and over and over and over and over again, all the different ways the reflection can be experienced to allow self-awareness to continue to express itself and consciousness to continue to express itself through all of those reflections that are possible. That is the structure and nature of existence. That is the structure and nature of God. Now, the idea of the reconciliation between what you call on your planet science and what you call spirituality, well, the bridge is consciousness. Some of the scientists on your planet are beginning to realize that you cannot have a complete theory of the universe without including consciousness, because you are conscious. And therefore, that is a quality of existence itself. Let's give you another analogy. Let's say someone were to bake you a cake, but they cut a slice of that cake out and give it to you. So you are not looking at the whole cake. You're only looking at your slice of the cake. Now someone suggests, why don't you analyze the ingredients of that slice? And you start to analyze it and say, well, there is flour, and there are eggs, and there is milk, and there is sugar, and a variety of other things. And that should tell you what the rest of the cake also contains. You are slices of cake. And if you are conscious, that's a quality that must exist within existence itself in totality. So everything is conscious in its own way, even though it may express it differently than you. If you contain what you consider to be self-awareness and consciousness, because you are just a reflection, an aspect, a slice of all that is, then all that is itself must also contain that ingredient. It's a quality of the existence that you are a part of. Just that you are expressing it in a different way than other reflections might, that's all. But all are self-aware in their own way, as they need to be to express the reflection that they are. So your science can begin to reconcile the idea of metaphysics and spirituality and science by allowing themselves to finally understand the mechanics of consciousness. Because when they understand the mechanics of consciousness in a way that I am describing it to you now, they can make their equations that make sense to them. They can use their language to understand it. But first they have to understand the nature of it, the structure of it, the mechanics of it, and why things are conscious, why self-awareness is consciousness. And as soon as they do that, you open the door to great understanding, a great many things.